Well, good evening and welcome again to Culture Underground. Here is the comic. Is it not nifty? Worship the comic. This is the tag phrase of Pete Abrams' long running webcomic, Sluggy Freelance. And if you've ever seen the homepage, you're probably already familiar with it. But as grandiose as it sounds, it's really not what Sluggy Freelance is about. I mean, it is pretty nifty, but it doesn't really demand that much in the way of cultish devotion, unless you count the Sluggy Facts database, which is a little extreme. But that's not really what we're here to talk about. I've chosen Sluggy Freelance as the starting place for my exploration into underground art for a couple of reasons. The first is kind of my first exposure to it. I started reading Sluggy Freelance when I was about, I want to say 16, 15 or 16, somewhere around there. I had already been running for a few years before I really got into it. But outside of things like shareware, computer games, video games, I really hadn't experienced a whole lot of art that came from a single creator with a single vision and no kind of studio oversight. And revelation to me in a couple of different ways. Um, and the biggest one was just how unpolished it. But before I get too much into that, a little background, especially if you haven't seen my introductory video where I talked about Sluggy Freelance a little bit already. Sluggy Freelance began in 1997, so it's been running for almost 25 years. It is a very long running webcomic. It's been fairly regular, like most webcomics. It has had periods of guest artists, just general downtime, and Pete Abrams only uploads 3 times a week, give or take, these days. But when it started, it was 7 days a week for most of the year. So a pretty heavy lift and very much in the mold of your typical syndicated comic strip. That anymore, but more on that as we talk about it. Uh, Sluggy Freelance is kind of groundbreaking and kind of not. It was not the first webcomic, but if you believe Pete Abrams, it was the first webcomic to be funded on a Patreon style system. It runs on the backs of the defenders of the nifty these days, which is essentially a subscription service. It's, I think, about $30 a month, or not a month, a year. And that gives you access to behind the scenes blogs. And I think at one time there was video chats with Pete Abrams. I don't know if that's still a perk. I've never supported it in that way. Um, I usually just get merch to support indie creators. I unfortunately don't have enough disposable income that I can support creators in quite that way. But you know, you kind of create that subscription model with premium content that is very popular these days. So you can see it as a groundbreaker in that way. It was definitely a groundbreaker in terms of how long it run. I followed a lot of web comics in early 2000s, mid 2000s, even the early 2010s. Gone. A lot of them are gone for one reason or another. Most of them because of creator burnout, which is an unfortunate part of the business. Some of them moved on to other things. Christopher Hastings ran a webcomic by the name of Dr. McNinja, which we are going to talk about at some point. But of course, he now writes for Marvel. And, you know, so there was more job security there, I'm sure. Maybe. Is he moved to Marvel about the time they started to go downhill. But I'm sure at the time it seemed like a pretty safe career move. Um, anyways, so Pete Abrams has run for a long time, and he's done things with his run that a lot of other webcomics did not do, both in terms of character development and in terms of just world building. There are a lot of long running web comics that are just hijinks or shenanigans, Penny Arcade is probably one of the most famous gag strips. And there are a lot of web comics that started like Sluggy Freelance with no coherent idea of a long running story that have tried to institute one, but just sort of um, make up ideas on the fly. And Abrams not really do that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we. But the other thing I want to point out is that Sluggy Freelance, interesting case study, why I think important to dig into underground independent media. It foreshadows a lot of the pop culture developments that we have seen in broader, more generalized forms down the road. What do I mean by that? Sluggy Freelance predicts nerd culture almost a decade before it comes into vogue. Um, a lot of the tropes and ideas that we see now in things like Big Bang Theory, that we see even on YouTube shows that talk um, about geek culture, are kind of foreshadowed in here. Of course, part of that is just the format and the interests of the author, but part of it, I think, is Abrams kind of tapping into the zeitgeist. And again, there were a lot of other web comics that were like this, kind of foreshadowing what we would see. Fans! Exclamation point was one. General Protection Fault and Help Desk were others. And they all had this kind of sense of geeks kind of claiming a cultural place and becoming very influential, and their ideas expressing themselves in the world in various ways through various means, most of which were kind of fantastical and very tongue in cheek, but none quite as fantastical and tongue in cheek as Sluggy Freelance. But let's look a little bit at actual art, shall we? We can see Pete Abrams has a very typical comic book / comic strip style, and that is appropriate as it is. It does really start out as a comic strip. So if we flip open here, book one this is actually an omnibus, so it's the original collected books 1 to 3 in a larger, more convenient, slightly more affordable package. Not really more affordable, but there you have it. So as you can see, here's the first 6 strips, and as you can see, it really just looks like a newspaper comic strip from the late 90s. It looks like it was inked with a Sharpie or a Bic pen. It's kind of minimalist art, and it's people standing around talking with word bubbles. Well, not even bubbles. It's just lines pointing to text. And this is what Sluggy was when it started out. It did not have particularly high aspirations. And it starts off kind of as a meta commentary on buddy comic strip. Our protagonists are Korg over here in the plaid, and Riff with the laser cannon here. He does not start with the laser cannon. That's the thing that comes in later. And that's all we got at the start. Then they decide they need a cute mascot character, so they bring in the mini Lop Rabbit, and they find out he has a foul mouth and a switchblade. Try to replace him with a bear, and he skins the bear alive. Pretty wacky. This is stuff that you really couldn't do in a syndicated comic strip, and I think this is one of the reasons why it wound up on the internet rather than in a newspaper. There's just a lot of bonkers ideas in here, and very quickly it goes off the rails. Within the first 2 months, I'd say, of syndication, we've introduced the girl, Zoe, and she's bringing some estrogen to the equation. And then almost right away, Riff is revealed to be an inventor, and he builds a dimensional flux agitator. And all of a sudden, we go from weird kind of geeky buddy comic strip to, we've slipped through time or through dimensions, and now we're in Star Trek land, trying not to get assimilated by the Borg. And from there, Pete Abrams begins to build a core collection of ideas, most of which are quite silly, at least in their execution, that become the core of a revolving series of almost gimmicks. I don't like to use that word. Tropes might be more appropriate. Um, Plot threads, you could also say. Here's another one, actually, a part of that same storyline. This character right here, yes, it's not just a xenomorph. That's Ailey the alien. She will be a long-running character slash MacGuffin in the series. And what Abrams does here is he just takes all of his favorite geek ideas and he begins stewing them into a single long-running kind of gag a day, a kind of structured long-running plot, and suffers a little bit, I think, in these early chapters from trying to be a conventional newspaper strip. Let me see if I can, if I had been thinking a little further ahead, maybe I would have looked some of this stuff up. But yeah, here's a good example. So once everybody gets home, and they have Ailey the alien with them, we kind of introduce this X-Files spoof. And we have this ongoing series for about a month, maybe 2 months, where they are. And they're digging into the characters, the new Mulder and Scully lookalikes, and they're also expositing on some of the shenanigans Riff and Torg are getting into. And there's this strip in here that just derails kind of what's going on. We can introduce the fact that Riff has an irrational, maybe not irrational, fear of the phrase Department of Motor Vehicles, which is a funny gag, but it kind of disrupts. I mean, if you were to read this in a page, it kind of disrupts the flow of the story. But at the same time, this was being published on a day-to-day basis, so it kind of worked standing alone. It kind of didn't. It's very difficult to parse, especially I'd never read this this part of the story as an ongoing story. I essentially binge read it long after it was complete. But yes, so here we are introduced to Ailey and some of her habits, like she can shapeshift, get out of problems that way. We're introduced to Riff inventing robots. This will be an ongoing thing. He will make robots for various purposes, primarily to destroy Ailey as an unnatural extraterrestrial life form that has no point on Earth. Riff does things like that. Sometimes, most of the time, with good reason. But he can be a little bit of a pain in the butt. Other ongoing story threads that are introduced here, we see Bun Bun kill the Easter Bunny, thus becoming the Easter Bunny. Nothing bad will come of that. Foul-tempered, foul-mouthed, switchblade-wielding Easter Bunny. I'm sure that'll go great. And, of course, there's also the introduction of demons from the dimension of pain. In fact, demons are kind of an ongoing gag here. These demons aren't really demons. They're just inhabitants of another dimension. There's also introduced in here, within the first month, there is Kazik the Vowelless, although we don't hear him named as such. We see him summoned using the Book of Evil. That's E-VILLE. And all of these things are ongoing plot threads. In fact, every major idea in Sluggy Freelance, the possible exception of Oasis, is introduced in this volume. And I find that to be really impressive. Pete Abrams had clearly a bunch of ideas inspired by the nerd culture of his youth that he wanted to turn into an ongoing story, and with no editorial oversight to kibosh his wilder ideas, with no with no naysayers there to tell him, oh, that's too, or why are you making this weird Star Trek reference or anything like that. He's able to set up and establish a bunch of really great long-running ideas that he explores in a lot of depth over the 20-year run of the comic, 20-plus year run of the comic. Here's another one. Yeah, there are vampires too. And then there's Sam the Man, the Vampire, later just the Sampire for short. And it's very difficult to explain just how engrossing the world of Sluggy Freelance becomes as you read this. You really need to experience it for yourself. And you do need to put some time into it. Like, if you are immediately put off by the gag that Griff and Torg are nerdy, insensitive guys, go out and get into hijinks adventures that are largely based on nerd culture, don't keep reading. It's not going to get any better. But if you like the idea and you just wish maybe Pete would do more with it, definitely keep reading, because every time these ideas come back around, they are more fleshed out, they are more in depth, they have more of an impact on the characters, they inspire more character growth, and they're better executed. And a perfect example with this is The Bug, the Witch, and the Robot, which is the title of the 6th volume of Sluggy Freelance. And this revolves around the aforementioned Kazik the Vowelless, who is an ongoing antagonist, and his relationship with Gwen, who is a friend of Zoe's. And Gwen has struggled with Kazik on several occasions in the past. And in fact, I believe the Stormbreaker saga is in here somewhere. Maybe it's not in here. So, again, maybe I should have researched this a little bit more. But the point is, there is a demon trapped in Gwen's brain now. And she goes through this long dream sequence. Many of these were Sunday strips, but some of them were daily strips. They have these weird distorted panels. There's writing all around the outside, and usually that's some kind of taunting from the demon or some expression of Gwen's subconsciousness. And there's all kinds of stuff happening in pages. Fascinating to read. And we get to follow this internal battle between Gwen and Kizik, even as there is an external struggle as the rest of the gang tries to figure out why she's acting strange, how they can free her. And it's funny, also very touching, and it's very, very, I hesitate to use, sure, it has great understanding of how people under stress will engage with their own mind, and also with their friends and their relatives, and how they look to them for support. So it is kind of a buddy comedy with a lot of geeky nature to it and a lot of hijinks, but it also has some very heartfelt moments to it, and a very strong execution on the idea of growing through recurring situations. One of the most controversial storylines in Sluggy Freelance was called That Which Redeems. And in it, we finally go to the dimension of pain, where all these kind of monstrous creatures have been coming from. And we learn everything that happened there to turn a dimension full of fairly normal people to a dimension full of warped creatures who enjoy inflicting pain. And it's not as funny as you're used to. As a matter of fact, the whole storyline is pretty serious, and that's one of the things that makes it quite controversial. But has a point in the overall story, and it changes toward, and it puts a capstone on these recurring villains, the demons from the dimension of pain, that is very interesting. And it makes me wonder, without going into it in too much depth, how much of it was Abrams trying to comment on the medium itself and how it struggled with putting out Sluggy Freelance over the course of many years. And it's really great to be able to see a single artist's vision play out and build upon itself cyclically over and over as a man refines his ideas and their expression over time. That I think is for me, one of the big values of this kind of independent underground content, because it is so driven by one person or a handful of people. You can dig into their understanding of the art, their understanding of their own role in the creative process as it evolves and as it grows. So, yeah, that's one of the big reasons why I wanted to start with Sluggy Freelance. And especially if you're interested in seeing what can really be accomplished by an underground creator over a long period of time, if you like comics, especially buddy comics, Sluggy Freelance, that's where I'd recommend you start. So that's all I've got for this talk. Again, as always, in the comments, let me know if there's any underground, independently created art you would be really interested in seeing me discuss. And go ahead and give a subscribe if you want to keep seeing this kind of content. I'll talk to you later.